UN Women describes the current situation as the biggest robbery in history. $160 trillion lost in lifetime earnings in just one generation. Now, you have dedicated your entire life to economic equality for women. And then you started How Women Lead.
I give women a sense of power in what's possible because of how I show up. It's pretty different. From 2010 to 2022, just 12 years, we went from 10% women on public company boards, which essentially means one person, to 34%. But by 2020, I was like, we need to start a venture fund. So we only fund companies founded by women with no male co-founders. And we are the only venture fund in the United States that has that
as the baseline.
Why? Women founders return 34% more for their investors. This is the best way to make money is people who perform better and return more. We would bring $4.4 trillion of earnings to all the investors if we invested in companies run by women. There is nothing stopping us except structural systems and our own commitment to it.
Before we get into that conversation with Julie Castro Abrams, the founder and CEO of How Women Lead, I just want to say thank you for watching the show. The Lakshmi Rebecca Show is brought to you by Makers, a borderless creative agency. Makers offers strategy, design, campaign, video, and podcast solutions to large and fast-growing brands. We also offer a unique book a cruise service across 100 countries where we can provide you a professional video crew anywhere you need. So talk to us for your next creative requirement and we will scale your brand with you. Check out our work on www.makers.com. That's www.makers.com. Once again, thank you for watching The Lakshmi Rebecca Show. If you haven't already, hit subscribe or follow. We are on YouTube and on Spotify. Julie, it's fantastic to have you here at the studio in San Francisco. Thank you for making the time today.
Well, thank you for coming to my city. I'm so excited that you're here.
It's a great city. I'm staying out with a view of the bay, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. A little cold, but beautiful.
Yeah.
So I have a bunch of questions today for you.
Let's do it.
And the topic is so fascinating. I've been thinking about equality for women and how long it's going to take to really achieve that. And I think data says absolute equality across different spectrums, we're still 300 years away. But I come into this conversation with a specific focus on economic equality, with the full awareness that individuals like you and me, who are sitting here having this conversation, have been through whatever we have been through to ensure, and despite whatever we have seen, ensured that we had a different life and a different path, and that we created a certain set of opportunity for people around us. And you have literally spent your entire life pursuing economic equality for women in America, right? And so I'm very aware that we're this micro minority, right? And what a privilege it is to be here, but also, therefore, also the responsibility to do something about the gap that still exists. So I was looking at some data. The world has a female population of 4.13 billion, of which 1.63 billion are in the workforce, so nearly about 40%. But the number of women who have economic equality is only 2 to 4% of that 1.63 billion. In fact, UN Women describes the current situation as the biggest robbery in history. $160 trillion lost in lifetime earnings in just one generation. And, if you look at it, 100 years ago, people hoped that by 2032, there would be economic equality for women.
Yeah.
Today, we're sitting in 2026.
We're
talking about it being, actually globally, we're talking about it being still 135 years away. So still a long way to go, right? Now, you have dedicated your entire life to economic equality for women. You started out with social work at the Chicago Foundation for Women. You then worked at a nonprofit that did, microfinancing for low-income women entrepreneurs. And then you started How Women Lead, the largest community of women, 175,000 women. And you've been focused on training women and creating opportunity for women in corporations through influence on policy. You've now gone into investing in women and creating funds with women investors alone. I mean, what a pursuit, a lifetime's pursuit. Where did this all begin? Was there a moment in your childhood that triggered this acute awareness around economic inequality of women, and what made you pursue this?
If you think about it, in the 70s and early 80s, really my childhood, that is when we passed Title IX. All of a sudden, girls could get equal opportunity and resources to do sports. So I was an athlete. I was a Division I athlete, which means I went to college as a swimmer. I remember my mother got an inheritance from her dad when her father passed away. And she had to get my father's permission to use that money. I just remember sitting in the car and her being furious right outside of the bank about the aggravation of that. And then the law was passed that women could have their own credit cards and all this other kind of stuff. And so I grew up in a really interesting time in the United States where there were these laws being passed so that sort of, rise in frustration and aggravation, watching the activists and seeing the change that happened. So there were such fundamental shifts that were happening. And we thought in my childhood, because all these laws were being changed, we were like, wait, we can do anything. There should be nothing holding us back. And in fact, one of the things that I took away is so important is to, make sure as a mom, when I talked to my daughters and other women, is that you could be president, you could be the CEO of your own company. Like that's the drumbeat that I really carried with me. And it felt like really liberating and exciting, but it also felt like a huge responsibility.
To change the cues, the deep cues.
Yeah. So I grew up with this transformational moment of laws being passed. Well, I would say, right about that time as well. This was before they passed the laws that if you got divorced, that there had to be a 50-50 split. So I actually also watched all of these contemporaries of my mom. Their husbands would leave them for the 25-year-old when they were in their mid-40s, and their kids were in high school or just got to college. And these women were destitute. They had nothing. They'd spent their whole lives committed to their families and supporting his career, and then they had nothing. So I just remember in my bones, I was like, that will never be me. I will never allow that to be, my story. And so I just felt from the beginning, girl athletes, they say that they're the most likely to become leaders. There's a strength that comes from being a girl athlete. And I really felt a sense inside of me of power and confidence and strength that I think was a huge gift. And I also felt a lot of privilege. I'm white in the United States. I grew up in the Midwest. I went to the best schools you can go to. I went to Northwestern. I went to University of Chicago. And I actually also grew up Catholic. And the way it was implemented was a bunch of hypocrites, to be honest. I'm just saying. I don't practice religion now. I had kids I had my first child when I was 25. I had to be I don't know if you remember people talking about this, but I had to be the perfect mother.
Yes. Because that's still the case for a lot of women.
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you, I had people criticize me so badly about not being there for every single school trip or not volunteering for every school, whatever. And I thanked those moms all the time. Like, thank you for doing that. Thank you for always showing up with the cookies in the room because I'm at work, right? But you had to be perfect there and you had to be perfect at work because you had a different measuring stick than the guys did. Mm. So what has happened to so many of us is certainly there's a physical cost. I got sick and have had to deal with a bunch of stuff. And you look back and you're like, oh, that's from exhaustion, stress, overwork. Of course, you're going to have some kind of physical result from that. It's also kind of interesting because my daughters and my son, they're like, I don't want to work as hard as you did, Mom. They saw it and they're like, oh, I'm choosing a different path. So here I'm thinking I'm showing them that you can do anything in the world. And they're like,
it's okay. We don't want to do everything in the world. Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I mentioned my generation. We're the first generation of women with more educational attainment than men. Women are the primary breadwinners in 46% of heterosexual households in the United States.
Wow.
Think about that. And
primary breadwinners in 46%
do you
households.
really think, all you women who are listening and are the primary breadwinner, even if you're not, do you really think your husband wants you to get paid less? Is he really going to be happy for you to be drugged back?
I didn't know the number was that high, 46%.
Yeah. I mean, I'm married to somebody who is sweet and kind and centered and such a family man, but he's not ambitious and he's never going to be aggressive in his ambition. He works really hard, but he just wants to support me and our family. That's really his goal in life.
And you've embraced that. You've embraced that.
I actually intentionally married him for that reason. It felt in 1989 when I met him that it was a binary choice. If I wanted to have a family, I was going to be with one of these guys that I went to school with. I was at University of Chicago in graduate school. I would have to take a step back in my career.
Yes.
And put him center and have financial risk and all the things I just saw that all my mom's friends were going through. If it wasn't that, I couldn't have children if I wanted my career to be centered.
Yes.
So what I did
is if you wanted to have it all, then this
I
is
looked
the
around
path.
and I was like, hey.
Yeah.
And the other thing is I threatened all these men that I went to school with. They were scared of me. They, and so that's a recipe for messiness when you threaten and scare people. But it's amazing.
You had that clarity so young. You were married at 22.
I married at 24.
24, okay. And so you chose very wisely and very carefully.
Well, ultimately
very
wisely, but I don't know if it was so careful. It might have been an accident. But okay, let's pretend like it. Let's pretend like I'm one of these guys. But I did I did make a very conscious choice not to do the other things because I knew myself well enough to know and how mad and upset I got when I saw that power over is super dangerous. And I wouldn't ever want to be somebody in a situation where I literally was so powerless, I would stay in a relationship that was violent or hurtful. So yeah, and it's interesting. The most powerful women I know, they married the plumber or the artist. If they're still married. So yeah, it's an interesting choice one.
That's so interesting. And then you had your first child at 25.
I did.
Yeah. What were you doing at the time? And then tell me about the journey between then and later, starting how women lead.
I was just out of graduate school and I had the gift or the benefit of being able to have some good consulting projects. I look back and I want to give them all their money back because I was like, I didn't know anything, but whatever. Somehow I was making it happen. And then, I worked in an alternative high school and created a bakery where the kids could work and learn skills and make money. And that was part of my journey. And then I worked at a music conservatory for low income kids and really was defining this theory for social change for myself, a strengths-based approach to poverty alleviation. So if you and I meet in an environment where you are a domestic violence survivor, and that's all we talk about, and everything's centered around you as a survivor, it's reinforcing.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for you to get out of that story.
Yeah. Where do you go from there?
Right. Sometimes you have to shed that because I might get benefit from being your savior and helping you little domestic violence survivor, right?
You feel very good about yourself in the process.
Exactly. And when I first got to graduate school of social work, one of the things they said, if you think you're coming into this work of helping others because you want someone to thank you, that is folly, and that's not going to be the case.
And also, that is a cycle of always you being needed.
Yes.
To do the rescuing.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not building a system or a movement that grows well beyond you.
And for a lot of people who go into that work, they sacrifice financially and physically. They sacrifice a lot. And so it feels really good to get all that thanks. But you're not owed that thanks. And those people, they're getting paid. You get paid to be working in a domestic violence shelter, and you're the gatekeeper. You may think you're not making much money and all that stuff, but somebody who has where you're the gatekeeper, whether or not they get the room, that's a huge power over.
Yes.
And people, human beings can get imbued with that. And we all know this. even in those small environments, they can abuse that power.
Yeah.
Because
So you saw
it's
this
giving
and you're
them-
like, no, this is not the way to do it.
My professors slapped us around in graduate school and said, watch out for this.
Okay.
And so I actually was so lucky to get some people being really honest and like that sort of, that white savior thing, like you must interrogate and stop that because that is really a problem. That's when you start to see, it's like someone like a Charlie Kirk. Like you see these people that they start to act like they're religious, and that they're somehow that God has endorsed them to do this stuff. Like, that's unacceptable, dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
So all that was part of my evolution in my own thinking and really trying to understand human behavior. How do you really work with people to reset their belief about themselves and that they can create environments and communities and opportunities that are really that really transform. And around that time, I also read this book called Forces for Good. This great PhD looked at the highest impact organizations. So that Forces for Good actually debunked a bunch of myths. So ultimately, if you work on policy change, systems change, laws, if you do movement building, which is hearts and minds, you tell 10 friends and I'll tell 10 friends and they'll tell 10 friends. So all of a sudden it becomes like a wildfire. And certainly with social media, you got some tools for that. If you educate people and give them the steps and the support and maybe even do some research, and then you actually get into action and do the work. So Habitat for Humanity, if you look at them, they've had a big impact in the United States on the zeitgeist of people thinking about housing as a right. They don't build that many houses. Not as many as you would think for the impact they've had, but it's because they work on policy and movement building and they work across the spectrum. So I took that and said, all right, if I want to move things, that's what I need to be thinking about in terms of the structure. I can't just say women on corporate boards, right? A lot of women in my generation got to the point where they getting pretty high in a corporate ladder, but how do you go do something new? Like being on a corporate board. It takes support and help and conscious effort and a structural change, and you have to rebrand and reposition your thinking, right? But just helping people get on a board isn't enough. We needed to pass a law, which we did successfully in California. Senate Bill 826 requires you to have 3 women on your board if you're a public company. We have 25,000 women in my network. Every one of them has at least thought about going on a board at some point in time if they're not actively pursuing or on a board. And then we place women on boards. So we do the whole spectrum.
Yeah.
And by no means am I taking any credit or responsibility for this. We were part of a movement, but from 2010 to 2022, just 12 years, we went from 10% women on public company boards, which essentially means one person, to 34%.
That's amazing.
And once you have 3 people in a group, and in that case, a little bit more than 3, one, you upgame the whole group. Everybody works harder and shows up differently because you disrupt groupthink, which is so dangerous. But you also all of a sudden have enough of a power base where you're not going to let it slip back down to 1 because you're on those committees. You're 34% of the decision makers in that group.
The environment itself has shifted.
Right. So that shifted. And then I looked and I said, well, by the time you're on a public company board, those are big institutions. They're huge. Moving a ship that's huge is a lot harder than a little dinghy, a little small boat, right? And so if you really want to impact culture, if you want to change some of the unequal pay and all the things and broken ladders where women aren't getting to the highest levels of an organization, you actually need to get in there earlier. So I looked at, okay, what's happening with private company boards? Well, first and foremost, who's on them? Well, it's usually the CEO and that's probably the founder and maybe their chief finance officer, right? 2 people that are operators. And then you have venture capitalists on those boards. And 65% of private boards don't have a single woman on their board. None. No one. They're all men. So in 2010, there were only 12 women-run venture funds in the United States. 12. And they were small, and some of them acted more like angel groups. Today, literally 15 years later, we have 380. So at the same time as we are transforming the public board space, we are transforming
The
who
private
is
boards.
the structure of who is investing in companies. And
That's
we know that
amazing.
when women are the decision makers, especially if they're the leader and running their firms, they're likely to invest 40% of the time in companies founded by women, which makes sense. 45% of all the companies in the United States that are started by women. Okay, that feels right. So that's happened. And here's another couple things that have happened. I mentioned earlier, women have more education than men. We've got great education. We're now 46% of primary breadwinners. So you have this generation of women who are smart enough, in it enough to really move into this space. And women have 54% of the wealth today in the United States, 54%. And there's a huge wealth transfer happening with all the baby boomers who are starting to move on to whatever's next. And they're handing that money over to their daughters and their wives because women live longer. Like there's a lot of reasons, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, women are going to have 60% of the wealth in the next 6 years. Think
That is
about
a
this.
huge shift.
Huge. So
How
here's
does
the
that compare to like 30 years ago?
30 years ago, well, let's say 40, right? Women didn't even have the right to spend their own money without their husband's permission.
So that's amazing.
It's a massive shift.
Yeah.
And so think about, you've got the infrastructure of women-run venture firms. You've got enough wealth from women and operational expertise to run it all and do the things and start the companies. There is nothing stopping us except structural systems and our own commitment to it. So women need to know, you need to start looking at investing in venture capital, a private asset. And those words sound big, I think, to some people. Because in the past, it's been broy and opaque and not inviting. And you didn't feel like that you ever would be like, that's not for me, right? And the media tells us, just put money in the stock market and you'll be safe. Well, that is not actually what's happening. In about 2004 or 5 or something, companies really they're staying private longer. They're not going into the public market. Some public companies are actually reverting to be private companies. So the public markets aren't seeing big growth in terms of wealth creation or wealth growth that we all want. So women, we need to understand this is where the money's made, and it's also where the power and the influence happens. This is where we ultimately get women to be the CEOs of the next huge Amazon, right? All the innovations that women are creating, to me, that's a huge, huge opportunity. And we can't squander this opportunity and allow ourselves to be drugged back into the early 70s before those laws were passed.
You know, it's so interesting when I hear your answer. I mean, you started this one in 2012. Yeah. So when you started How Women Lead, was that actually the case that you're like, I need to build an ecosystem and this is how I'm going to do this?
There wasn't the clear initial vision. Let's be clear. A lot of what happens in life is opportunity, and you're like, oh, there, the light goes off. What did happen for me is I worked in poverty alleviation strategies with people who were living in extreme strain. And the cost to you, the secondary trauma of someone who does that over, in my case, 20 years is a lot. And I actually came to realize, like, okay, I did my part.
Yeah.
I'm exhausted. And in fact, I said, I'm never running anything again. I'm just going to do some consulting. And
this is after you ran WISE, the nonprofit,
exactly, the microfinance organization. It was beautiful, and I'm a quant nerd, from the University of Chicago. Like, I had a statistician on staff, and we were really diving into what happened to women. We had magnificent outcome numbers, and you really saw the difference. They talk about women or people. The most successful people in a small business or in a startup have a lot of grit. All right. Who do you think has the most grit in the United States? An immigrant, someone who already took the risk-taking behavior of leaving their home country, starting over and, doing whatever it takes to build a foundation. So they're going to do it at all cost. And frankly, it's a family affair often. But the other thing that happens is they're really clear about developing and building assets. So I actually loved watching and seeing the data that would support who really can start great businesses and what does it take and what are the potential outcomes for people in terms of both their income growth, but also asset growth. And you think about, women who have been vulnerable, who might have been taken advantage of. Well, they were, all of them, whether it was through a life partner or if it was in work environments, not getting raises, sexually harassed, like all that horrible stuff would happen to women that I would work with all the time. And really seeing if you start your own thing and have agency, what a powerful way to transform and really step into a new stage in your life, right? But I was tired, and it was.
How long did you do that for? How long
did you run? 12 years with that organization.
For 12 years,
yeah. And before that, I was 7 years in the music conservatory. All wonderful work, but just the cost.
Yes,
adds up. Yeah. And was raising my own family at the same time. And so, in my mid 40s, I was done with running that organization. My children were already off to college, and I was actually there. It's sort of interesting, and I looked up and I was like, wait, I think I have to live another 50 years. If I live as long as my mom and my grandma, what am I going to do? Because I'd already done the stuff. In your 20s and 30s and
so
early 40s.
That's why you started How Women Lead.
I know. Well, in your 20s and 30s and early 40s, you're building your family, your home, your career. But usually, everybody's different. But sometime between mid 40s and mid 50s, people wake up and they're like, oh, wait, there's more to life. Or I want to reset. Yeah. I'm not going to just do the grind the same way. And a lot of people will leave bad employers in those ages, in that life.
Bad marriages.
They leave bad marriages. They shed some friends that are reinforcing an old you.
Yeah.
Because it benefits them, right? And we are also starting to realize I have finite life force and energy and time and money and resources, and I want to put that towards stuff that I believe in.
Yes.
And I want to do it in ways where I can thrive instead of be so depleted. So it's a beautiful moment in time, and it's called Middlescence. Barbara Waxman wrote a book about this. And it really is this really magnificent renaissance for people where you really get an opportunity to reset and rethink all the parts of you. And one of the things we know is women are happier if they're doing things with other women and if they're having an impact. So I was in my break. I would every single week, it was like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. That's all I kept saying over and over again. But there came a moment where the aha happened. So someone had written a book on the neuroscience of teams, and she wanted to get in front of some corporate women. I was like, okay, great. I'll bring some people together for lunch. What was interesting is I think I invited 70 people and 65 people came.
Okay.
And I thought I'd get 10 or 15 people to come to lunch. I had to keep getting a bigger room. And people were so happy to be together. And I looked around the room and I was like, oh, I guess my friends are all kind of running stuff. They're all at the top of their game. And people are really like, I've never been in a room with this many powerful women who are all in the C-suite and all doing all these, really in positions of influence. And they wouldn't leave. The restaurant was like, you're going to have to pay $1,000 to, have the room for more time, And I was like, wait, there's something here. And so I learned about Middlescence, and I thought, okay, what do we all have in common? Well, certainly we all have hit this level of success. We have power and influence and money like no generation we've ever seen before. And a lot of those women, they're like me. They're like, I'm going to do more stuff for another 50 years. I'm like, I'm not done. Are you kidding me? In fact, my board of the bank that I ran, those women all helped each other get board seats on public company boards. I watched it happen. They kind of did what the guys did, which is like, okay, Anne, I'll help you get on this board. Michelle, I'll help you get on that board. And Evelyn was, getting everybody, opportunities. And I thought, well, why don't we make sure all the women know how to get on a board? And then let's do a little more of that. Create these smaller experiences where people could build those friendships. And it's like, I gotcha. I'll help you over there. You help me over here. And together we'll win. And so that was sort of the beginning of How Women Lead. Frankly, my friend Vivian Shu put together a LinkedIn group, and that was kind of really, it forced me to have to keep going with that group of people. I might not have done it if it wasn't for Vivian, to be honest. And people were like, do this again and I'll bring 5 friends. So I'd buy out a bar. After a while, I was like, you're paying for your own cocktails. Like I got enough, right? And I incorporated it and made it a thing. But I really started thinking about that systems change. And I was like, well, what if we transformed what corporate boards look like?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of the first push. And of course, all kinds of things around women's leadership. But by 2020, I was like, we need to start a venture fund. We need to actually fund companies founded by women. We are the only, and we did. In 2 months, I essentially raised a $10 million venture fund. And it was in COVID. Once people found their paper towels, toilet paper, all those paper products, we were all pretending like no one could get, right? Once everybody got a little settled and they were like, okay, well, I'm sitting at home and I got a little extra time because I'm not commuting. Yeah. So we all figured out how to use Zoom. And I was like, all right, let's do this. And send me all the great women founders you know. So we only fund companies founded by women with no male co-founders. Mm-hmm. And we are the only venture fund in the United States that has that as the mandate.
The baseline, yeah.
Why? Women founders return 34% more for their investors. They're more capital efficient and performance driven. That just makes sense. They actually don't go out of business when the guys do. So one of our founders, she's a PhD from MIT. Literally, people wouldn't fund her startup, so she applied for and won 35 pitch competitions in 18 months to get this started. That woman is not going to give up when times are tough. Talk about grit, right? Yeah. And 50% of our investments are in companies run by women of color. A ton of them are immigrants, and that just makes sense. So, so I feel like I am. One, we're making money because this is the best way to make money is people who perform better and return more. Yeah. You were talking in the beginning about women having economic opportunity and power, but let's be clear. We're in a tentative situation today as we sit here in the United States. We've got a war going on. We've had stock market complete up, down, and people who are abusing their power and knowledge. And we think there's about $500 million or trillion or billion, I don't know, so much money that someone just stole when they started a war and told people about what the president was going to do. So we need to start our own stuff. And we have the power, wealth, and influence. There's nothing stopping us. I feel like if we can all get with the program, and here's the other really important thing. It's not just the structure of how you make the change. It's where are we starting from? Women culturally have been taught to tear each other down. We have movies about this called the Mean Girls movie or whatever, right? I'm gonna tear you down before you tear me down. Like if that's the culture, that's what I feel like I experienced growing up. But I'm at a life stage where I'm like, I am not going to be around people who tear other women down. I don't want to hear it. And I don't trust you if you do it because you're going to do it to me. Yeah. And so what if we all come together and we consciously say, we're not doing that. We're doing the opposite. We're not doing this thing where women's voices are unheard and it's crickets when you write your next book. We should all be singing it from the mountaintop. Everybody listening to this podcast, send it to 10 friends. Like we need to reinforce each other's success. You can look in the press, in the news, and newspapers. We are not quoted in the newspapers. Films that have a woman who is the primary person in the film, the protagonist, the women speak less than the men still, even in those films. Yeah. So, and ultimately, deal make. Say yes. Let's make introductions. If you say, hey, would you introduce me to so-and-so? I should say absolutely and take just a little extra time to do it. If we can start to do all of those things together,
we rise and lift up together.
Then we've solved the problem because we've got the power, wealth, and influence. Now all we need is to break down the cultural barriers. That's what I'm all about.
Fantastic. Okay, so when you started with a focus on corporate boards. You explain how that happened also, right? It sort of came about organically. If you were to pitch this to corporate boards today, what would you say is the benefit to them to having more women and a diversity of women on their boards?
Every single study shows you make more money and you manage risk better. Product recalls happen 3 times faster. Everybody knows that it disrupts groupthink, and groupthink is what is dangerous. And so I don't talk about fairness. This is a financial imperative. it is just better for all of us. So anyone who's a shareholder, I don't know if you know much about how corporate boards work, but in a public board, you're accountable to the shareholders and other stakeholders, of course. But those shareholders will rise up and say, hey, we know that having all one type of person having the same conversation is super dangerous. So get with the program and diversify your board. So there are people who are shareholders that are holding people accountable now. They should do it more, but they are.
And what are the benefits to governments, to countries, when they encourage economic equality for women?
Well, first and foremost, GDP. I mean, you want more money for this country. You want to actually make sure that there's a better standard of living. You want more innovation. If you have 50% of the population that's not invited to innovate, or they're so beaten up and exhausted that the innovation bug gets squashed, that it hurts everybody. So it only benefits the whole if you continue to support and help women thrive. And it's not, women thriving doesn't mean men are not. Right now, I'm really reflecting a lot on the patriarchy and what the matriarchy is. A matriarchy is not women over men at all. A matriarchy is centering children and families and communities. What a concept. It's not one person over. And so I just think it is time for all of us to have a reckoning and a reassessment of how we can sustain our society. And women have got to step in and step up, because right now there's this massive pull back to the patriarchy, especially in the United States. And right now we've got all this stupid press that talks about, boys and men are in crisis and all this stuff. It's like, every single measure says they're doing just fine. And giving them some victim hat to put on is not helping anybody. And I really think we have to figure out what are we willing to tolerate? And this is the opportunity.
How is How Women Lead structured today? Tell me about the organizational structure. So it's set up as a nonprofit.
How Women Lead is a nonprofit, and it's really a network. It's not a membership organization. Mm-hmm. In part because I don't want to owe 25,000 women. Like there's a point at which people, they send you a little bit of money to be a member, and they all think they get hours of my time, and that's just unsustainable, right? So part of it is just my own stuff. Somebody else could probably run it and do a better job than I am. But what is really the case is you have to commit to the credo to be in the network. And if you are tearing other women down and are mean, I ask you to leave the network. So that is the magic and the glue.
And who runs this with you? Do you have other partners, co-founders? How does it work?
Well, I'm the CEO.
Okay.
Yeah. And I have people on my team. I have 80 board members, 75% of whom are women of color, which is strategic and important. For me, we need to design our strategies with women of color in mind, because white women always get their needs met. So that's how I've designed it. And then we have a venture firm that is a traditional limited partnership.
This is How Women Invest?
Yep. It's its own entity. Mm-hmm. But we have 600 investors that are women who are first-time investors. And I would say 95% came from How Women Lead.
Got it.
So it is... I think the power of this network of 25,000 women could change everything globally. We just have to all decide where we're marching towards, and we'll do it.
Got it. So when you talk about influencing policy, so there's a core group that comes together and works on things and lobbies.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And let's say I'm part of the community. I don't live here, but let's say I did live here, and let's assume for a second that I was part of the community.
Yeah, but we have people from all over the globe that are part of the community. So you're in. As long as you commit to the credo, you're in.
Got it. So I get to participate in events and conversations and network with other women in the community.
Yeah. And you can say to me, hey, I have this thing I'd like to be put on stage. As long as it's interesting to our target market, we'll put you on stage. Or if you say, hey, I'd like to connect with women who look like this, the CISOs of a company, great. I'll go find all the CISOs in our network and I'll connect them to you.
Got it.
So this is, and people do it with each other, and I have nothing to do with it, which is, to me, that's the biggest win. When someone just said to me, they were part of a board's training program in 2017. And at the end of the program, we were like, okay, get in these smaller groups and hold each other accountable. Mm-hmm. People call it a mastermind group or something, but it's self-organized. Literally, they all just went on a trip together, a travel trip. like for a weekend. So to the fact that people are still intimately connected 10, 15 years later, to me, that's magnificent. How
Yeah, that's
great is that?
amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
And helping each other, putting each other on boards and so investing in each other's companies and giving each other contracts and jobs.
And how many women as an organization you think you've helped put on a board, whether it's a public or a private board?
You know, it's hard to answer that because it's certainly thousands. I do some direct placements, but more often I will have somebody call me and say, hey, can you give me, recommendations of people who look like this? And I'll generally find out somewhere along the line if they chose our candidate or not. But we're doing that all the time. So I would say at any given moment, we have 4 searches we're doing. So it's not huge volume, kind of like Habitat for Humanity. It's some, but it actually reinforces the rest of our system. Like every time I do a formal placement, the chair of the board writes me or calls me and is like, I don't know how you found this perfect person. And but it's inevitable, right? It's kind of amazing to me that people are so surprised that women would add so much value. And if you think about it, if you're trying to get in, if you are so lucky you got an opportunity as opposed to taking it for granted, you work harder, you perform better, you produce more. So
absolutely. Tell me about the stories that have stayed with you. With all this work that you've been doing the last 14 years of building how women lead, the companies that you've funded, the women that you've placed on boards, the women who've met each other and helped each other out. What's like the number one or the top 2 stories that you're like, oh my God, this is why it's worth doing this and I can keep doing this?
Honestly, I can tell you, I get that story every day. I get somebody saying, "Thank you, you changed my life." So this weekend, this woman, and you would look at her and you're like, "Oh, she has so much privilege." So let's just start. I'm going to acknowledge that. But she said, "Listen, I have worked in hostile, destructive experiences for so long, and I met how women lead, and I learned the credo, and I was like, never again. I'm not doing that to myself anymore." And so she started a company and she last year had a great year. But the beginning of this year, she was like, oh, I have fewer contracts than maybe I wanted. And somebody came to her and it was somebody who was they're a really messed up company. And they weren't listening to her. And she's like, and I kept thinking, am I desperate enough to take this or am I going to stick with my commitment to myself? I won't work with people like that. And she stuck with her commitment and she wrote me and she's like, you've changed my life, because to be taking that kind of work when I know it's going to destroy me,
that sucks a lot more energy than it's going to,
and just that sense of like, I have agency. I don't have to be a victim to, or I can say, no, here's the line in the sand. And that this network gives her enough, job opportunities, et cetera, corporate opportunities that she doesn't have to. Like, what a gift that is, because so many of us feel like, well, I have no choice. I have to work with people who are mansplaining, sexually harassing, just making roadblocks instead of making it easy for me to do the work. And that doesn't sound like it changed someone's life in the way that you might normally think, but to her,
no, but the
did.
power of no.
To her,
knowing the power of no is very important.
Right.
And it is scary as an entrepreneur to say no to something and to turn down an opportunity. But turning down an opportunity that doesn't give you the right amount of returns opens up space to go after opportunities that do give you the right amount of return or even more than what you might have originally hoped for.
Here's another example. There's this woman, her name is Amy Allison. She's magnificent. She we do travel trips because you build really deep relationships when you travel with someone. So we were in Cuba.
I'm signing up for the next one.
I know, come. We were in Cuba together. And thank goodness we got to go before. I mean, boy, is it Cuba's having a hard time, and we're responsible for a lot of that because of U.S. policies. And she said, I've always been the number 2 person, but I want to be the number 1 and lead something. And everybody was encouraging her. And she had this idea. She had thought she was going to write a book called She the People. Mm-hmm. It was all about women of color in the United States and how there's such a critical and yet very much taken advantage of group of people in the political environment. We just assume they're going to vote Democratic, for example, if you're talking about elections. And the Democratic Party was spending, and the Republican for the most part, but really the Democratic Party was not spending any money on women of color as a voting bloc. And they weren't having policies and practices. They weren't. They were just taking them for granted. And she was like, listen, women of color are going to decide the next election. A bunch of us, supported her in creating this vision of this, of gathering together all the women leaders and create an agenda. And that was her plan. So I was like, go meet my friend. And they met and she gave Amy $50,000 to start this. And all of us brought together some resources and gave her another $25,000. So she had a little bit of money from us, which really made me feel great. So anyway, so she did this big conference. And then the next thing she did was go through our fellows program with these global leaders I was talking about. One of the things we ask you to do is come up with a big, hairy, audacious goal. And Amy talks about it and she's like, oh my God, I thought I was going to throw up when I said the words out loud. But she said, like, my goal would be to host the first debate for the United States presidential election hosted by women of color and about policies for women of color.
Okay.
And she did it 3 months later. She hosted the first debate in that whole election cycle. She was on Rachel Maddow every other day on CNN. Amy literally reset the conversation, and that's when Joe Biden was elected president. Now, having a woman of color win the election was ultimately a goal that didn't happen. Our hope is that with someone like Amy, whose power is immense, she is one of the most inspiring people you'll ever meet in your life. But being a part of Amy's journey and supporting her to me is an example of something that, takes my breath away.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And it's so true that, you might have had an audacious idea lurking in your head. And it took a while to get to that idea and to accept it and to recognize it. Yeah. But then to have the room and the space to voice it and then have someone say, you go do it. Yeah.
Not just saying, okay, we believe in you, but like, here's some money to go do it too. So anything's possible. And if you look around and you're like, oh, there are 25,000 women who will have my back. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
How lucky am I, huh? I get to meet all these cool women.
Absolutely. And the energy. Look, the energy around you and the energy you get from fabulous. That. Yeah. What next for how women lead?
Yeah. We're actually in a moment of both opportunity and considerable peril. And I think it's really about having women understand the opportunity and peril and all collectively come together and say, we're going to step in and step up. We're all too busy. Neither one of us has enough time to go, lead and step up into these other spaces. So I think it's helping women really understand how to carve out the time and the space and just take those distinct actions that are going to change the future. Because there are financial moves each of us can make. Literally, how much money do you have set aside for retirement or saved in other places? What is that total amount? At least 10% of that, maybe 20%, you need to be thinking about how can I use that money and invest it in women starting companies that are solving for problems that I see in the world. I'll give you one example of a company. Mm-hmm. We just had a big lawsuit. Facebook has to pay a lot of money because of the damage they've done to children and with how with their product and how it's been designed and reinforced. There's a lot of harm being done to our children, and we're all scrambling. What do we do about it? And feeling like you can't possibly have your kid, the one kid who's not on social media ever, right? Mm. So there's a woman, Kate Dirksen, who created this solution that's an AI overlay for 7 to 13-year-olds when they're texting, when they're in their games, any platforms, and it will say to the kid, hey, this looks like bullying behavior or predatory behavior. We recommend this.
It guides
and then
live.
The parent gets the same message. There's a Netflix show that won all these awards, and it was about a little boy who was 13, looked like he was 9, and he was in his room getting caught up in all this manosphere stuff. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say manosphere?
Yes, absolutely. Hang on.
Yeah.
Is this the one where a girl ends up dying?
He killed a little girl.
Yes. Okay, I've seen this.
Yeah.
My husband and I watched
Right.
this.
Isn't it
Yes. And it's set in
breathtaking?
England, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I've seen this.
And
yes.
the thing that was
Yeah.
interesting about it is you were thinking that those parents must have made a mistake. They're like, he was in his room. What could possibly be going wrong? And he got caught up in this stuff. So Sage Haven by Kate Dirksen, second-time entrepreneur. She's killing it. It is a protective mechanism. I could give you so many examples. We would be here all weekend of women solving for the problems caused by society and men. So we need to fuel the women to solve those problems and then create economic vibrancy for all of us.
Mm. Okay, so yeah, I think the question was about what's next.
Yeah. What's next for me is well, I'm raising $1 billion fund of funds, and I'm trying to drive $1 billion to other women-run venture firms. So just that. But that to me is like, yeah, I'm on the road for both of those. So there's going to be another big one. Maybe you and I should have a conversation. Maybe some of the people watching this today should send in their message. What can a group of powerful corporate women leaders do besides, helping women social impact leaders, being on their board, giving them money, doing all those things we all know, but what other transformational things that would require policy shifts, et cetera, could we really do? Yeah. We're constantly looking at the environment and thinking, what can we do to change things?
It's so interesting. I was reading about you earlier and listening to some of your other talks. And at one point, somewhere you talk about the power of money and the power of power in making the shift happen. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that. Yeah. And I'm a big believer in this. I come from a nonprofit social work background.
Yeah, same.
And I know how far charity will go. It'll only go so far. You're going to be fixing the same problems on repeat. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be building a system that's going to sort of just transform and sustain. Right. And I'm therefore, really in awe of what you've built with how women lead.
You and I both know from our work, there's enough money to solve all of this, to give everyone healthcare, housing, and food. Yeah. There's enough. Yeah. And what we need to do is literally recreate our systems so we stop with this patriarchal power over where a CEO is making $50 million and his employees are on food stamps. What are we thinking that we've allowed this to happen? Yeah. So how do we reset the cultural norms and commitments so that everybody can thrive? People talk about AI. Like we just had a situation where the president of the United States tried to say to Anthropic, we want AI to make unfettered decisions. The AI should decide who to kill in a war. And Anthropic was like, no, that we won't. That's a line we won't cross, right? Yeah. But AI could be used to feed every single person on this planet and make sure everyone was safe. And literally thinking about how we've created these food systems that are so destructive of people's health. But you go to France, right? You can't find processed food really in the grocery stores. Yeah. We're sitting over here eating red dye in the United States. But in France, they also said Apple products are designed to be obsolete in 2 to 3 years. And France just proved it. And they just said, no longer are we going to allow this, because what happens is then the phones are just being thrown away and hurting the environment. There has to be durability, which is what, not to be like weird talk about the, old days, but that's what I grew up in. If your washing machine lasted for 25 years, that was a success, not the one that's fancy but breaks down in 3 to 5 years and you have to get a new one.
That's true. I miss that.
Yeah.
I miss the machines that last forever.
Well, I mean, and it's a choice. It's a design choice. This is not something we're victims of. We know exactly how to make durable products.
So you're saying that you want more women in government influencing policy on boards to build so that we can build a society, we can build a world that is far more sustainable than it is today.
I want that, but I also want women to inspire a cultural shift that benefits us all. I love men. I'm married to one. I birthed one, But we cannot continue with this patriarchal rape and pillage mentality. So
Yeah. Tell me about money, the
Yeah.
role of money
Yeah.
and funding and the right kind of funding
Yeah. Yeah.
to facilitate,
Yeah.
ensure more economic equality for women.
Well, Morgan Stanley said we would bring $4.4 trillion of earnings to all the investors if we invested in companies run by women. Like by underinvesting, we're all losing out on economic opportunity in the United States.
What have been your biggest lessons as an entrepreneur?
I think my biggest lessons as an entrepreneur have to do with believing in myself and taking risk and figuring out ways to do it without, I'll tell you, like I don't go ask people to invest in my work if I don't think that they're aligned with my values. I'm lucky because I'm at an age and a life stage where I don't have to. I think I actually created the credo because I'd run an organization where women actually started tearing down other women. And I was like, oh, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah.
And really understanding how do you set a culture in your startup? And then how do you stay lean and mean and make sure that you've got people alongside who are really rowing in the same direction?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty easy to, when you hire people, there's a lot of people out there who are like, hey, I'm clocking in and clocking out.
So finding those who believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And believe in it long term. What are the biggest things you've learned about yourself in this process?
So as a little girl, I was energetic and loud and smart. And, they talk about bossy girls, right? And I remember I was so far ahead in math. Like our teacher was like, oh my God, get her out of the classroom. And I remember they put us into another room, this other girl and I, the two of us sat there and we weren't even learning math. We were doing our nails when we were in 7th grade. It was like, what were they thinking, right? But I just remember constantly being told, talk less, shrink, you're too much. And I think as an adult, one of the biggest things is for me to be able to say, that was about them and that was cultural and that I don't have to continue to carry that with me. And it was very interesting. I still do it, which is so nutty. I teach it and then I still have the mistake. I was with a bunch of women public company directors recently. Mm-hmm. And I said something about to someone about, oh, well, I'm kind of intense and I'm kind of big, big energy. And she's like, Julie, every single woman here this weekend, it was 20 of us, every single woman here was that little 8-year-old girl who was raising her hand and was told to put her hand down because she'd already talked too much.
Yeah.
And I think, we continue to carry this around with us, the shame of the being corrected or told, stop taking up so much space, give somebody else space. Yeah. I'm looking at your face and I'm like, I think you get what I'm talking about.
I get it because I used to ask so many questions as a child and my mother would be so frustrated. And I was just going to tell you, I love doing this job because I get to ask all the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but you were either told to be quiet or you're told, speak up, speak up, speak up. And in a moment where it's like, the more you say speak up, the less I'm going to speak up, right? So we were all told we weren't enough.
Yeah.
And that is what the culture has done to so many women. I'm sure men have their own stories about not having emotional range, etc. But I know women. I study women.
Yeah.
And if we could just forgive ourselves and know that we're enough, that group of women I was talking about, I think collectively they've probably been on 100 public company boards. I mean, these women are extraordinary. One person has been on 37 public company boards in her life. Wow. Her first board she was on, she was like 27. And I say this because I want you to understand, you and I look at them and we're like, these are the most powerful women in the world. I got them together for a weekend and I literally realized after the first couple hours, I was like, oh, they all are intimidated by each other and they think they're not enough. And I had to stop everyone and say, every single one of you is supposed to be here. And how do we get each other to feel you're supposed to be here and you're right?
Yeah.
You're just the way you're supposed to be.
Yes.
Of course you're not perfect. Of course you're not done.
Yeah.
If you were done and
but
you were
you're
perfect.
great the way you are.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all evolving. How boring to be done.
Yeah.
You got to keep evolving.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
How many companies has How Women Invest invested in till date?
How Women Invest has invested in 35 women-run companies.
Nice. Okay. And they're all based here in the U.S.?
They're all U.S.-based. And if you look at the data, it says 80% of all startups fail, venture-backed startups.
Yes.
We've lost one. one out of 35. And I say that because women do things differently.
Yeah.
And because it's so much harder to get any financing, if you get financing, you're not going to go out of business easily.
Yeah.
And every one of them is solving huge problems you and I care about. They're not starting the next dating app. They're actually starting things that really matter.
Tell me a bit more about the fund. Like, do you fund very early stage? Are there follow-on rounds later?
Yeah, all of that. So in startup land, when you're going to get venture funding, we define things as pre-seed means I have an idea. Seed means I develop the prototype of that idea. Now I'm going to go test the market. Series A is I know what my market is. I got the right product. Yeah. I'm just about ready to go to town and scale. And then everything else beyond that is just growth. They're kind of different. Those are almost two very different kinds of analysis. So I have a seed fund, pre-seed and seed fund. So that's early. I got to be really patient. I got to really double down and invest in the founder and their grit and their vision. And for a Series A investment fund, which I have a vehicle for that as well, that really is a much easier analysis because you can see their track record. Then it's really about, can I help them scale up? And are they really about to hockey stick or not? And can I own enough of the company to make a lot of money? So it's just different analysis, right? And so I have vehicles for both. Okay. And we'll invest up to $5 million in a company, depending on the stage and what we believe is the opportunity.
Got it.
So it's real money and it's real change.
Yeah, and of course the network also that comes with it, right?
Yeah, I mean,
and that's something I feel like a lot of the times when entrepreneurs seek resources, seek funding, they're looking for a lot more than just the funding, right?
Yeah. Well, if I say to you, there's this woman who is scaling something really exciting and big, would you give her 10 minutes to talk about what you know and give her some advice? You're like, psh, sure. Yeah. I like being asked for my advice, but I also want to help the next big thing.
Yeah, and I want to learn what they're doing.
What they're innovating. Yeah. And so I've designed our firm and our funds so people get to see the innovation. You get to hear pitches. You get to be involved. And you actually, like every month, we're like, okay, this company needs an introduction to somebody who looks like this. They need a technical resource like that.
I'd love to come to one of these events just to observe.
We basically crowdfunded. We have 600 investors in our fund. And they're all operators. They're all great like you. I can find anyone. We can get people enterprise contracts like nobody's business because of the power of these women. And they've all committed to the credo to help each other. So they're going to support that entrepreneur till the end of days.
Just out of curiosity, do you know the deal value that's been enabled through the network?
Oh, that's a great question. Through the network. I mean, I've got multiple examples of $10 million contracts that people have gotten. It's clearly a couple $1 billion. So
it'd be fantastic to...
Significant.
Yeah. I think that's like a huge stamp of validation, right? You should brag about that. You should find that number and brag about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Of course. If you could sum up your biggest achievements in 3 sentences, what would they be?
Well, it all depends on how you want to approach this, but I would say being a wife and a mom and successfully having a 37-year marriage and having a new grandbaby, because that has been the foundation that has allowed me to feel like I could go fly. In the tough times, I go back and I hold that grandbaby, or I hug my husband, or I feel that sense of safety and support. And I have been so inordinately blessed. I can't even begin to explain to you what a gift that has been for me. And I know how blessed and lucky I am because that's not how it works out for most women. Yes. I know, to be honest.
Yes.
I would say the other things that I feel like I've really accomplished is, so in the United States, our diversity is our greatest superpower, frankly. But a lot of what we've done is we've centered white people, this sort of Caucasian, Eurocentric frame. And what I've done with this network is we have 50% women of color. We have massive numbers of immigrants and women from all different backgrounds. And we all come together and we sort of commit and share together in sort of how we want to see the world, and we all do it together. And that, to me, is probably one of the most powerful things. I spend a lot of my time saying to women, like, when they'll blame women for not asking for not applying for a job unless you have 100% of the criteria. Well, yeah, no kidding. Because literally the culture hires, promotes, and invests in men for their potential. women are hired, promoted, and invested in for what they've already done. It's not the same rule book. We learn it from the time we're little.
Yes.
So we grow up in
Prove
this
yourself.
environment where, of course, I'm not going to apply to a thing that I don't have 100% of the qualifications for, because everything in the culture, everything has told me that that is going to be folly, right? But for the guys, they'll be like, well, I could do that. Why not? You know, and we kind of get aggravated.
You give it a wild shot. Wild shots are okay.
It seems aggravating when you watch somebody do that with such, it feels like they're maybe being pompous or something. But the reality is that's what they're invited to do in the culture. Okay, here's another thing. I've never worked for a man in my life. And I've run my own thing since I was 32. So the reality is I've never built the muscle. One, I'm not necessarily going to be super successful in negotiating with them because I haven't built the muscle to be, whether it's subservient or the way people talk.
Yeah.
To
navigate that environment.
I've never learned it. And so the reality is I give women a sense of power and what's possible because of how I show up. It's pretty different. And I think the gift of frankly never having to learn that code shifting that is very expensive and costly to women for their health and their careers. That is something I haven't had to master, thank God.
If somebody were to start a similar movement in another country, right, where the focus is economic empowerment of women, where would you suggest they start? Yeah. And what's the framework they should apply to maximize the impact in the fastest way possible?
Yeah. I think in every culture, in every community, there's got to be that group of women, let's just say between 40 and 70. How do you activate those women to make change? And how can you get all those women to come together and commit to being better with each other and not allowing those negative cultural norms to continue and really say, how can we aggregate our power, wealth, and influence to help everybody rise? I think that's a great
starting point. And then what's the framework you suggest they follow?
I love having a network where people have a shared commitment to each other and they all can say, we're solving for these 2 or 3 things: women's economic, leadership, political power. Now, I'm saying this from sitting in the United States. There's a certain privilege and context. And there's also a lot of problems.
And that's a given. Contexts are different. The problems may be different. But those are very broad pillars you've mentioned, right?
Exactly.
So that would still apply in
whether
most countries.
It's about getting girls to school or getting, sanitary products. Like there's so many other things. But if you get a bunch of, aunties and grandmas together, you should be able to solve for all those things.
Yeah. And how do you fund this? Where do you begin to fund a nonprofit like this? And when does it start to make enough money that you can do more?
Well, really, for me, I just decided that we were going to design things people would pay for. You'll pay $50 or $100 to come to the thing. I am not working with low-income women. I'm working with women who have resources. Yeah. So it's super lean. And we say, hey, would you give of your time and your expertise? I'll give my time and my expertise. If everybody at least pays for their tacos, we're set. Yeah. So I've created an environment that's super lean and super leveraged with people's expertise and what they can bring to the table.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Julie. I think that was super inspiring, and more power to you. Go get that $1 billion fund going.
Well, it's wonderful to talk to someone who gets it so deeply. You and I both are social workers by training, and it's a really important way to launch into the world, and whether you work in finance or in communications and spreading narratives. So thank you for your movement building work.
Of course. Thank you so much.